welcome to this Female Coaching Network feature and interview with me, Vicky Highton, the founder of the Female Coaching Network, and our special guest today, Catherine Baker. Catherine is a former lawyer, chair of the steering group of the O-Shape Lawyer, and has extensive experience as a non-executive director. In 2015, she founded the organisation Sport and Beyond, a coaching and consulting firm supporting senior leaders and teams to drive sustainable high performance. Catherine is also now the author of her brand new book, Staying the Distance, which is a dive into the lessons from sport that business leaders have been missing. It's an incredibly insightful, inspiring and thought-provoking view of what it takes to be a successful leader, whether that be in business or sport. And refreshingly from this time of book, it was filled with plenty of accounts from female coaches, athletes and leaders, and is crammed with lessons that every one of us can take away and implement in our roles as leaders and coaches. And Catherine has been a big support to me personally throughout my own journey with the Female Coaching Network. So I know firsthand just how impactful Catherine's work is on individuals and organisations. So to be able to delve into her book is something I've been super excited to do. And of course excited to be able to chat to Catherine about her own journey in writing the book. So thank you again, Catherine, for joining us for this interview. And I'm really excited to find out, like I say, about your journey of writing the book and the thoughts behind it and all that kind of thing. So I think the first question I want to ask you really is about your journey and the process of writing the book, because to me, the idea of sitting down and finally starting sentence one, page one of a book is quite terrifying. To nail down the exact ideas that you wanted to do and all the endless amounts of research. So what has this experience been like from you from kind of day one up until now, really?
Yeah, lots I can share on that, Vicky. But first of all, thank you for having me on today. It's a real privilege to chat to you. I'm so pleased that you got so much from the book. And as I've said to you, it's been so lovely seeing your journey with the Female Coaching Network and where you've got it to. So I'm really delighted to be on today. So the journey of writing the book, gosh, fascinating. All-consuming at times, certainly a constant learning journey. I think the idea to write a book crystallized in the summer of 2021, but I'd probably had it sort of as an idea subconsciously before then. And the reason I say that is that I had always listened to podcasts or read things about authors in terms of why they wrote a book. What was it that had sort of encouraged and motivated and inspired them to actually set their thoughts down in writing, what the process was like, etc. So it's something that I'd always been interested in listening to and learning from other authors. Obviously, once my decision crystallized in the summer of 2021, I was a bit more proactive. So I made sure I talked to as many people that I could who had actually written a book. I actually contacted quite a few authors and said, can you give me your top 3 tips? And that was really useful and actually fascinating to see the sort of consistency and commonality between them and then some of the differences as well. So I think it probably wasn't as I expected. I really was a complete novice. I went into the process incredibly naive around how to get a publishing deal. I thought you kind of sat and wrote a book and then went to publishers, but actually it's very different. You put what's called a book proposal together. You may have written 1 or 2 chapters by then, but the book proposal is very much, this is what I've got to say, this is the golden thread through it, etc. So I'm sure we might pick up on some of those things as we go through, but certainly for me, the realization that what I wrote first was going to be rubbish was important. And it really, really what, it's like anything in life, you've got to start, haven't you? You've got to throw yourself in and you've got to start. I think if you put too much pressure on yourself that what you write first is going to be good, you're probably never going to get started. So to your point about, sitting there thinking, gosh, how do I start? It literally is, I went into a room one day and just sort of started typing out without having really thought about structure or whatever, just to get myself started. That awareness that what you write first isn't going to be good. I did hear one author on a podcast refer to it as your vomit draft, which isn't a great term, but that at least gave me a little bit of kind of comfort. And I think one of the things I talk about in the book quite a lot is focusing on the process and, the outcome will take care of itself. So that talking to people about what worked for them, what was the process they followed, trying to think through for me how that was going to look. All of that really helped me get started and get going.
And I know this is almost a bit of a silly question to ask, seeing as you literally you're not even a week into the publication of your first book. But if you were to do a second book, what lessons would you take so far from this first book that would make life easier for the second one?
Yeah, I'm gonna have to get used to that question, aren't I? I'm still obviously consumed by this, but yeah, I got a lovely message from my twin at the weekend saying, "Do you know what? It's really good. I think you should write a second book." So I think one of the things that really helped me was actually I took on a book coach. So when I kind of knew what I wanted to say, I knew I had all of this stuff here. I could get it down, but it perhaps wasn't really clear and really sharp. So I took on a book coach who'd been recommended to me, a lovely lady called Alison Jones. And I just had 4 hours of her time, but she was invaluable in saying to me, Catherine, what's the golden thread? So what's the clear concept that's going through this book? So I think if I were to write another book, thinking about that probably slightly earlier would be helpful. And obviously for this book, it's about sustainable performance. So not just sort of high performance in the moment or winning, which is a lot of sport to business, but this issue around sustainable performance. And obviously very timely, because when I sat down to write, we were still sort of through the pandemic, etc. So I think number one, that kind of golden thread, the sort of clear concept that goes through. Be really open and seek feedback. I think that was something that I think I did relatively well this time. I was very determined to come up with a very good book, not least because Gareth Southgate had so kindly lent his name to it and agreed to write the foreword. And that was brilliant for me, not just in terms of being really grateful for him for doing that, but also actually as okay, this has got to be good now, to really sort of keep that professionalism and high standard in the book. And so I did seek a lot of feedback. My husband was really useful in reading every chapter. When I was looking at the sort of initial ideas, I would ask lots of people and say, what do you think? And people would say, this bit's rubbish, this bit's good. But all of that is important, because the more you do that, the more the end product is better. I chose 6 what are called beta readers, so 6 people who would be kind of likely target audience when I felt comfortable with my draft. And they kind of pulled some bits apart and suggested some bits sharpen up. So that thing about being really open and seeking feedback. I think the point I've already made, that to accept that at the beginning it's not going to be good. And that's really, really important. I think the final thing, I remember I was sitting this is my home office, in this chair on a Friday evening. And I just had, I think, my second session with Alison Jones. And I can't remember how we got there, but I had this revelation about the chapter structure. So I'd been struggling with the structure of the book and how to divide up the chapters, etc. And I suddenly had this revelation, and I literally wrote down the name of, actually it was 14 chapters to start with, it's now 13, but I literally wrote out the names of the 14 chapters while sitting here on a Friday evening, and then went to have a very big gin and tonic. But it was, something just unlocked there. So once you've got that chapter structure, it gets a lot easier.
Wow, yeah, so a lot of work gone into those 13 chapters. And talking about work, you obviously did a lot of research, and you've got a brilliant reading list at the end of it of lots of different books that you've read. So kind of 2 questions really, and this one is, what was your favorite story that is in the book that you came across that you shared with everybody? And also, what's your favorite book on that reading list?
Yeah, so it's difficult to choose a favorite story, isn't it? Because there are so many. I think I'll pick up on one because it's so instantly applicable, and I think very relevant at the moment. And that's the story around micro breaks. So this is a story around tennis, which is one of my sports. I've played sort of both tennis and hockey to quite a sort of high level. So always tempted to come back to my favorite sports, and so one of which is tennis. There was a performance psychologist called Dr. Jim Loehr, who, and we're talking quite a way back now, back in the 1990s, wanted to find out what it was about there was a small number of tennis players who were consistently winning all the big tournaments. And he wanted to find out what it was about this group that kind of set them apart from everyone else. those of you listening who know sort of elite sport, particularly individual sports, there's often not that much difference between, say, number 100 in the world and number one in terms of technique, sort of tactics, etc. So he was kind of sitting there a bit confused. Why is there this small group of players who are consistently winning the big tournaments? So he started to look at hours and hours of videotape, as it was then, and he went to live matches as well around the States and elsewhere, and continued to be really frustrated because he couldn't see what they were doing differently until he started to look at what they were doing between points and between games. So in other words, not when they were playing, but when they were not playing. And these top players were using that time very, very differently. They were giving themselves a proper reset. So between points, they were turning their backs to the court. They were decompressing, they were breathing deeply, they were removing that previous point from their heads before turning back, having reset both physically and mentally, ready for the next point or ready for the next game. Now, of course, we see tennis players doing that all the time, but at the time, that was a very key piece of insight. And actually what Jim Loehr did was, once he discovered this from the analysis of videotapes and matches, he actually put heart monitors on some of the players to see the difference. And actually those elite players, their heart rate was going down more quickly in those breaks than others. The reason I think that's a really powerful story at the moment is bring it into working life. We all know there's some brilliant insight and research around nutrition, around hydration, around sleeping, and we all understand that's really important. This, though, is some insight which we really can apply on a daily basis in our working lives, particularly, I think, as we're spending more time like this, having meetings virtually in front of our screens, etc. How often do you give yourself a micro break? So if it's 5 minutes between calls, it could just be literally standing up and stretching. It could be going to the loo. It could be making yourself a cup of coffee. It could be looking outside or even wandering outside if you've got a garden. So I think that lesson from there around the benefit of micro breaks. And of course, that doesn't just benefit your performance that day, but if you put those in day after day after day, it has a really good cumulative impact on performance. So I think that's my favorite story. I'm going to not follow the rules though, Vicky, I'm afraid, because I'm going to mention one other story, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Because I can't not, with you so kindly interviewing. I absolutely love the interview you did with Jane Figueiredo. She was such a great guest. You asked brilliant questions. And I think the piece that I took so powerfully from that story, as I say in the book and as I said at the time, was the level of care that she had for Tom Daley and the other divers that she was coaching. We talk a lot, obviously, about, high performance in sport. We talk a lot about that relationship of trust between coach and athlete. And what that interview really pinned down for me was that when you're really pushing athletes or people in the workplace hard, you're really trying to get the best performance out of them. If you don't have the right level of trust, you're not going to be able to do that. And what underpins that trust is that you know that your coach or the person leading you genuinely cares, both about you, about the organization, about the team, about the output, etc. So I really love that interview. First, because Jane was such a great guest. She was really entertaining, wasn't she? Yeah. But also because it really helped me clarify that point there.
Yeah, I'm very lucky back in February that I spent the day with Jane. We invited her to an athletics event, and she is one of those people that you just hang off every single word. Yeah. So yeah, it was such a brilliant interview. And also to know that somebody as successful as her, as in multiple Olympic gold medals, that's how they treat their athlete. Whereas unfortunately, there's a lot of other stories coming out in the media around abusive coaches. Yeah. Where they think you have to abuse the athletes to get those Olympic medals. But to come from someone like Jane, it's a bit of an eye-opener, really, isn't it?
It is. And I think, again, translate that across into business, that shift from thinking that as a business leader, you've got to be all stick and sort of domineering and, that kind of command and control, but actually realizing now through all the research and insight, but also what we're seeing on the ground, that more, high support, high challenge, that more facilitative, that really trying to get the best out of people around you is so much better as an approach to take, whether that's in sport or in business.
Yeah, we definitely need more of that in sport.
Yeah, and that brings me really nicely to the book. So I'm going to slightly cheat on this question, if I may, because partly because this is you write a book and you get it out there and you think, oh no, I forgot to do X, Y, Z. So one of the things that I didn't do, despite that a long reading list where I've set out some of the amazing books that have influenced and inspired me, and all those books there really, really genuinely have, I'm going to recommend a book which I forgot to put in my reading list, which I'm devastated about. So this is a book called Multipliers: How the Best Leaders Make Everyone Smarter. And it's by a lady called Liz Wiseman, with a chap called Greg McEwen, I think you say his surname. It's quite old, but the reason I'm recommending this, A, as I said, I feel terrible I forgot to put it in my reading list. But this book probably started my whole journey around understanding the distinction between the type of leader which Liz Wiseman talks about as a multiplier, who makes everyone around them better, as opposed to a diminisher, what they call in that book a diminisher, the type of leader that kind of squashes everyone down and thinks they've got to be the smartest one in the room, they've got to answer all the questions, etc. So it's as I said, it's quite old, but it's a brilliant book, and I really recommend it to people.
Okay, that's 2 books now for everyone's Amazon list. Is yours and that one as well. So another thing that really stood out to me about your book is the really refreshing amount of women, high performing women, leaders, coaches, athletes, etc., that were in your book. And like you know, I'm quite an avid reader and read quite a few of the books on your reading list. And whilst they are all brilliant, they really do lack examples of women at the high performance level. So having so many amazing women in your book, kind of like a bit of a twist on the question, which I hope isn't too much of a hard one to answer. But obviously, being a woman yourself, did that just come naturally that you already knew of all these amazing women out there, and therefore Mel Marshall, Jane Figueiredo, etc., you know, you're going to put those in your book? Yeah, was that kind of a conscious effort or just something that came naturally to you being a female author?
It was very much a conscious decision. I think probably anchored on a number of things. Firstly, the fact that so many of these books from sports business are written by men, and as you say, they are brilliant, they're insightful, we all learn loads. But I just felt that it was time actually to have a woman writing one of these books, and in a credible and sort of professional way. Also, many of the subjects covered in so many of these books are male. Actually, there's one of the catalysts again for me in this was there's a book called The Making of a Leader by a chap called Tom Young. It's a brilliant book, and it came out of off the back of a PhD that he was doing, but it features 7 male leaders. And Tom's very open about the fact that he were he to write another book, he'd sort of push harder to try and find some female subjects. But that was probably a catalyst. As well, I think if I go back to very early days of my professional career, so as you said in the introduction, my first career was as a corporate lawyer. And I was really, really fortunate to train and qualify at a firm called Linklaters, which is known as a Magic Circle firm. So one of the big global firms. And I was surrounded by, professional, high quality people. It was a brilliant start to my career. I qualified into the corporate law department, which traditionally had been very male dominated. But there were 2 female partners. And that was really important to me in seeing that. I think if you can't see it, it's very hard to believe it. So for me to be able to look ahead and see there were 2 female partners in this department, one of them had children. Unfortunately, she had to have a day nanny and a night nanny because that was the only way that she'd managed to do it. So, that generation ahead of me, I'm always so grateful for, because they really had to blaze that trail and make a lot of sacrifices to do it. But I think, if you can't see it, it's hard to believe it. And I think if we think now, in politics, you've got people like Jacinda Ardern, Christine Lagarde. You've got people in business like Dame Alison Rose. You've got the sports people that we all know about, the administrators like Dame Catherine Granger, Sally Munday. You've got Sarah Powell, who, of course, is CEO of British Gymnastics. We think of the amazing female athletes like Serena and Venus Williams, very keen as part of their broader purpose to show that women could be strong and successful as well as beautiful, and particularly for them also that Black players could do really well, because obviously when they were growing up, that wasn't a thing. Think about people like the Lionesses and what they've demonstrated in that, again, that broader impact they've had around PE and football and lessons and things. So, and then broadcasters, I think people like Alex Scott and Jill Scott now, and Maggie Alfonsi. Again, the more we can see it, the more we can believe it. So I think it is really important.
And staying on that theme of male and female leaders, with your work with Sport and Beyond, you've done an awful lot of work in various organisations with leaders. And there's been a lot of research out there about the different skills and attributes that men and women bring to leadership roles. And I'm just wondering, have you noticed any particular patterns when coaching different genders? Are there different skills that each one bring, or does it just depend on the type of person that each individual is?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, Vicky. I think I sometimes worry if I work too hard to make sure that the answer is no, because I sort of hope there isn't. So let's take it back a bit. I think in coaching in the sports world, there is a bit of insight and research to show that there are sometimes differences between coaching a group of women and a group of men. One of the things, for example, often gets highlighted is that women want to know why, so they'll ask more. So if they're given a training routine to go and do, they won't just go and do it. They'll ask why they've been told to do it. So that's one of the things that suggests that difference. I think, though, it's more nuanced. So from my experience of coaching leaders and working with leaders, we all have our natural traits, don't we? We're all going to have our natural strengths and our natural traits. We also all build up different tools in our toolbox through the experiences that we've had. But I do try and avoid the labeling of sort of male traits and female traits. One of the best female leaders I've worked with is very direct, thinks very, very strategically, very good at decision making. Those could be traits which, in the old days, people have said they were a bit male, but why? That's just her particular strengths. I've got other male leaders who I work with, one in particular. So through my role as chair at O-Shaped, I, as well as sort of keeping a broad overview, I also coach the founder, Dan Kane, who's a brilliant leader, and he demonstrates amazing human skills, amazing empathy. And actually, if you think about someone like Gareth Southgate as well, similar, the things that get pulled up and highlighted in terms of his leadership, it is the things like empathy, understanding the importance of culture, really caring about his players, etc. So my answer is no. I think that it's about individuals rather than genders. But I appreciate that not everyone's going to see it that way.
Yeah. And going back to the book and what you've learned through doing Sport and Beyond, if you could choose one lesson from any of the chapters in your book that would impact a leader the most, something that would perhaps change their behavior or impact the people they work with the most, what would that one lesson be?
Yeah, I'm glad you gave me this question in advance, Vicky, because I had to think about this one quite carefully. So I'm plumping for how to prioritize your time. So that's chapter 6. So that's the last chapter in part 1 of the book, which is how to get the best out of yourself over the long term. The reason I'm plumping for that is I think it is fundamental to so much of the rest of the book, but also how you perform as a leader. I think one of the things that I often see through my coaching of senior leaders is that the more senior we get in our working world, the more capable we are, the more we build all those different tools in our toolboxes. We can pretty much do, by the time someone gets, let's say, a CEO, they can probably do a lot of the roles and tasks in their organization. When you're a senior leader as well, you're often quite dutiful, quite purposeful, quite conscientious. So, you genuinely care and you want to do a good job. The danger with both those things coming together, though, is that you try and do everything. You take on too much. So partly because you can, and partly because you feel it's the right thing to do. And what I often take leaders sort of on a journey with in this area is understanding that as a senior leader, your time is a strategic asset to your organization. Anything you do with that time has an opportunity cost. So for you and I, Vicky, on this call, we're having a lovely time, but there's an opportunity cost because we're not spending this time doing something else. For senior leaders to understand that their time is a strategic asset, that everything they do has an opportunity cost, and therefore they have to think really carefully about how to best use that time. That then, brings us into areas like really understanding your role. So absolute clarity about what it is that you should be doing and what it is that you shouldn't. And remember, just because you can doesn't mean that you should. So I think that's a really, really important principle. Along with that is the ability to say no. So, if people are asking you to do things, saying no. Partly that's up to you as an individual, but often it's also having a good gatekeeper around you, whether it's your EA or PA or whatever you term them, but having a person or a team around you that really helps you do that. So I think that's important. I think the other thing around that is realizing that you have a responsibility to manage your time and energy. One of the pieces of insight I reference in the book is a McKinsey article that came out in 2021 looking at the mindsets and practices of the best CEOs. And they start the article by categorizing the 6 areas that they think any CEO should be involved with. And one of the 6, or when I ask senior leaders what do they think they might be, often I get a really good list, but the one that they never come up with is number 6, which is managing one's own time and energy. So I think, again, realizing that as a CEO or a coach or a senior leader in another position, yes, you want to give of your best and give a lot to your organization, but actually in order to do your job and give of your best over the long term, there is a responsibility to manage your time and energy. The switch I always talk about is when I get a pushback, Catherine, I'm too busy to go to the gym or take my walk or go for a run or whatever. I switch that to I'm so busy that I must go to the gym, go for a run, have my walk, because that's how fundamental that is then to that sort of sustained performance.
Mm-hmm. It kind of links in with the mini breaks, doesn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah, putting in that work. So one of my favorite chapters in the book was chapter 13, How to Navigate the Ownership Conundrum, and it opens up with the story of a former All Blacks coach, Graham Henry, where he explains a situation where his captain kind of asked him, are those pre-game talks more for you or for the team? And I think the reason why that really resonated with me was coming from a coaching background. I really think one of the worst habits that coaches have is over talking. And quite often, if you're able to observe that from afar, it is really more for the benefit of the coach, almost as if they're nervous energy or whatever it might be. And I think that was a really key lesson, especially using a team such as the All Blacks, which is, about as successful and elite as it gets from a team point of view. In your work coaching leaders in business, how difficult is it to guide a leader or a coach into understanding that concept that your job is basically to empower your athletes, your players, or your staff? And are there just some leaders that won't let that go and don't quite understand that concept that I think you alluded to earlier on about just taking a step back and allowing your staff, your players to kind of take the lead?
Yeah, I think it's another really good question, Vicky, and I'm glad you've drawn it out because it's so critical, I think, to sort of modern leadership. I think there are 2 levels, aren't there? There's understanding that you should be doing it, and then putting that into practice and actually doing it. And they're 2 very different things. I think Mel Marshall articulates it absolutely brilliantly in that quote I put in that chapter around too often we prepare the road for the athletes rather than preparing the athlete for the road. And I think that just sums up so beautifully what it is that we're saying there. We think about coaching before we move into leadership. That Graham Henry story is very powerful, and sort of understanding that pre-match team talk was more about him than for the players. Not only did he never do another pre-match talk, but actually the All Blacks now let the players run the kind of half-time talk as well. What are you doing there? You are giving your players ownership and control. You are enabling them to think independently, to work things out for themselves. That's so important, isn't it, on a pitch? Because even in sports where you've got a manager or a coach on the sideline, they can't communicate all the time with the players. And we know players don't often take in and absorb the messages they're receiving either. So it's so important for players, whatever sport they're in, to be able to understand, interpret, and analyze what's in front of them and make their own decisions accordingly. In terms of, across into business, are there some who resist this? I mean, I'd like to say that I would have a faith in human nature that anyone can get there. Certainly, we think about growth mindset. I may not understand it yet, but hopefully I will get there, or I'll get someone else to get there. So I probably haven't had an experience yet of a leader not getting the concept and not agreeing with the concept. Where it becomes more difficult is them actually starting to behave differently, to operate differently, to start to relinquish some of that ownership and some of that control. And if we think even back to that Graham Henry story that I used at the beginning of that chapter, just can you imagine how many times he must have been so tempted in the dressing room before the players went out to kind of do that team talk again, but he just knew it wasn't the right thing. So,
Yeah.
Again, it's about working really hard to try and make sure that you put into practice habits and behaviors that ensure that you are slowly stepping back and removing yourself and really giving that ownership and control to others. There's other things that I pick up in that chapter around making sure that there's the scaffolding in place. So in other words, don't just expect that your staff can suddenly do everything. You've got to make sure that they've got the right training, they've got the right skill set, they've got the right capability. There's a really good story around GB Women's Hockey Squad and how they did that with something called their Thinking Thursdays. So one of the clear principles for the Rio cycle for the GB Women's Hockey Squad was that they did think more independently. They had more ownership and control. Rather than just expecting that to happen organically, Danny Kerry and his team, his staff team actually instituted something called Thinking Thursdays, where I won't go into the detail now, but it was an opportunity every Thursday for the players to really practice having that ownership, having control, making decisions, getting things wrong, resetting, adapting, etc. So, it's definitely the way forward for leadership. I appreciate it's not easy. And I think once you've got that understanding, it's then working really hard to put that into practice and to keep yourself disciplined on it is really important.
Yeah. So just before I ask you the last question about tips to budding authors, I wanted to ask you about before you became an author, 2015, as I mentioned in the intro, you founded Sport and Beyond. So you were a corporate lawyer based in London, and now you live in a beautiful area of Yorkshire. So why did you decide to kind of leave being a lawyer behind in big city London to kind of a quieter town in Yorkshire, and then obviously move into coaching leaders and move away from what you were originally doing?
Yeah, so a few years ago, off the back of a friend who's a FTSE 100 CEO who had been to a 6-week course in Harvard, I realized the importance of really defining what it is that you're all about. So this particular friend had had 6 weeks in Harvard on a leadership course, and he'd come back and I said, what did you learn? And he said 2 words. And I was like, really? You've paid to go to Harvard for 6 weeks to learn 2 words? And he explained that really the course was all about understanding what is your personal mission. That acted as a good catalyst for me to sit down and think, what do I feel my personal mission is? And it was a really interesting process to take myself through. But I ended up with not 2 words, annoyingly. I really wanted to get it down to 2 words, but I couldn't. But I got inspire belief and enable progress. So inspire belief and enable progress. When I think back to my career as a corporate lawyer, with the first interview I ever had, not for my training contract, but for sort of vacation scheme, I remember being asked, why do you want to be a lawyer? And I said, because I want to help people. And I nearly put my head in my hands as I said the answer, because I thought that's just such a weak, kind of woolly, answer. What does that actually mean? But it is genuinely what I felt. And so I think that thread has been there throughout, whether I was, working as a lawyer where, okay, it's in a very different way. And certainly the big firm I trained in, I was such a tiny cog in the big scheme of things, and I spent an awful lot of my time photocopying and making cups of tea to start with. But it was essentially around, you've got then a level of knowledge with which you can help your clients achieve what it is that they want to achieve. The sort of move across into a different sphere was definitely slightly sort of precipitated by moving up north. So my husband, who was also a lawyer, decided to go into the family business. It was never the plan, but the family business was based in Leeds. At the time, we had a 1, a 3, and a 4-year-old. So life was fairly hectic, and I was really struggling, kind of juggling everything. So moving up to Yorkshire was great. So for my husband's work, I tried to carry on working as a lawyer down in London, but it just became kind of not very feasible. So I guess I went through a bit of period then of treading water. So I took on some roles. I taught on the law degree at York University, took on a couple of training and facilitation roles. I was kind of treading water, but making sure I was testing and challenging myself and learning new skills. When the children then got a little bit older, and I guess I could lean out from them a bit and lean back into career a bit, the opportunity to bring together my love of sport, my passion for sport. You know, my first qualification was a tennis coach. I still play. My children call it Yorkshire Grannies. I've just qualified into the Yorkshire over 50 age group, so I still play exactly. So, still, you know, so bringing together the love of that with my real interest in leadership, how you get the best out of people, because there is so many similarities with coaching and sport across into leadership. So to be able to bring that together and set up Sport and Beyond back in 2015 was just amazing, and it's been quite a roller coaster since then.
Yeah, amazing. Right, I could sit here and carry on and ask you another 10, 15, 20 questions, Catherine, but I know that you've got lots of book promotion to do away from this. So the last question I'm going to ask you is, what tips would you give to budding authors that might have like a little concept of an idea for a book in their head somewhere? What tips would you give to kind of support them on their journey?
Yeah, I really hope that these tips resonate. And I think, you know, anyone out there who has got this budding idea, just do it, right? Because, you know, why not? I think in terms of specific tips, think really carefully around why you and why that particular book. So what is it about you, your experience, your background, your perspective that makes it different from anyone else who's written about the particular subject, for example? But also, what is it that you're writing about that's different from the other books out there? So, as I said, for me, I had to think really carefully and really get it honed down to, this isn't just about, you know, lessons from sport around high performance or winning, but very much around sustainable high performance. So think really carefully about, why you, why does your expertise and background and all your experiences give you a voice on something which no one else has? And then, and you know, again, for me, that was very much that the crossover I have between the business world and the sports world, and the privilege that gives me in kind of understanding how to take the best and kind of apply that across. And then, what is it that you're really trying to say that's different? I think, as I've said before, accept that the first attempt will be rubbish. And that's, I think, so important in just helping you get going. I think do whatever works for you in terms of approach. So you'll hear some people who will say, I just gave up all my other work and just sat in a shed for 3 months and wrote a book. You'll hear other people who say, I wrote 4 hours every morning and then whatever. That neither of those approaches were going to work for me. I've got a family, I've got a job, I've got 3 non-exec roles. I really had to do this around everything else that was going on. I did say no to some work during the period so that I did have enough time to dedicate, but I found I had to snatch moments of time. That works for me because I like kind of, you know, moving from one thing to another. So don't feel if someone says I did it this way, you've got to do the same. I think there is no one particular route, really working out what works for you. The final thing, breathing space. So I think, as I said at the beginning, it can be quite all-consuming at times. And, you know, every time you're not doing other things, you're kind of thinking about it and you're trying to snatch time to write words down and finish chapters and stuff. I found that between part 1 and part 2, I had a couple of weeks not thinking about the book at all. And that breathing space was really helpful and really important. I think both in terms of my kind of mental and physical reset around it, but also you then approach it slightly differently. It's a bit like going on holiday and you think about things differently when you come back, isn't it? So I found that really helpful as well.
Amazing. Kevin, thank you so much for spending the time to chat with me, and everybody out there, go and buy the book. Couldn't recommend it more. Absolutely brilliant. And again, thank you for everything you've done to support me and then continue to do with the book as well. So huge congratulations. Can't wait to see lots more reviews and to see how well the book does. So thank you, Catherine.
Fabulous, Vicky. I've really enjoyed it. I hope everyone enjoys the conversation and gets lots from it.